1948. A History of the First Arab-Israeli War by Benny Morris. This history of the foundational war in the Arab-Israeli conflict is groundbreaking, objective, and deeply revisionist. A riveting account of the military engagements, it also focuses on the war's political dimensions. Benny Morris probes the motives and aims of the protagonist on the basis of newly opened Israeli and Western documentation. The Arab side, where the archives are still closed, is illuminated with the help of intelligence and diplomatic materials. Morris stresses the jihadi character of the two-stage Arab assault on the Jewish community in Palestine. Throughout, he examines the dialectic between the war's military and political developments and highlights the military impetus in the creation of a refugee problem, which was a byproduct of the disintegration of Palestinian Arab society. The book thoroughly investigates the role of the great powers, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, in shaping the conflict and its tentative termination in 1949. Morris looks both at high politics and general staff decision-making processes, and at the nitty-gritty of combat in the successive battles that resulted in the emergence of the State of Israel, and the humiliation of the Arab world, a humiliation that underlies the continued Arab antagonism toward Israel. Benny Morris is professor of history in the Middle East Studies Department of Ben-Gurion University, Israel. He is the leading figure among Israel's new historians who, over the past 2 decades, have reshaped our understanding of the Israeli-Arab conflict. His books include Righteous Victims, A History of the Zionist-Arab Conflict, 1881 to 2001, Israel's Border Wars, 1949 to 1956, and The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited. (1948) 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War. For Elia, Stav, Eyalia, and Zohar. David, Marie Sirkin. Suppose this time Goliath should not fail. Suppose this time the sling should not avail. On the Judean plain, where once for all mankind the pebbles struck, suppose the tale should have a different end, the shepherd yield. The triumph pass to iron arm and thigh, the wonder vanish from the blooming field, the mailed hulk stand, and the sweet singer lie. Suppose, but when what grace will go unsung? What temple wall unbuilt, what garden bare? What plowshare broken, and what harp unstrung? Defeat will compass every heart aware. How black the ramparts of a world wherein the psalm is stilled, and David does not win. Acknowledgements. I thank my brother Professor Benny Kedar for reading the manuscript and for suggesting corrections and additions. I also thank Dr. Hillel Cohen for going through Palestine's Arabic newspapers from 1947 to 1948 for me and enlightening me on their contents. I thank the University of Maryland and especially Professor Chaim Lapin of the History Department and Jewish Studies program for providing me with a year-long fellowship that enabled me to complete much of this book in College Park during 2005 and 2006. Over the years, I have consulted my friend and colleague Yoav Gelber about this or that aspect of 1948, and he has always been generous with his time and knowledge. I extend my thanks to George Borchardt for steering this work through the shoals of the publishing world to a safe and proven shores of New Haven, and at Yale University Press to Jonathan Brent for taking me aboard, and to Annalise Finnegan for chaperoning the work through the production process. Working with them was a rare pleasure, as was working with Laura Jones Dooley, who brought great skill and experience to the editing. Great thanks go also to Ronnie Bluestein Livnon for her industry and care in making the maps. The fruit of her labor was crucial to the book. (1948) 1. Staking claims. The historical background. The War of 1948 was the almost inevitable result of more than half a century of Arab-Jewish friction and conflict that began with the arrival of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, or Palestine, of the first Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe in the early 1800s. These Zionists, Zion, one of Jerusalem's hills, was by extension a biblical name for Jerusalem, and by further extension a name for the land of Israel, were driven both by the age-old messianic dream embedded in Judaism's daily prayers of re-establishing a Jewish state in the ancient homeland, and by European anti-Semitism, which erupted in a wave of pogroms in the Tsarist Empire. The 19th century surge in national consciousness, aspiration, and development in Italy and Germany, Poland, Russia, and the territories of the multinational Austro-Hungarian Empire provided an intellectual backdrop, inspiration, and guide to Zionism's founders. The Jewish people was born in the land of Israel, which it ruled on and off for 13 centuries, between 1200 BCE and the 2nd century CE. The Romans, who conquered the reconquered the land and suppressed successive Jewish revolts in the 1st and 2nd century CE, renamed the land Palestina, derived from the country's southern coastal area named Pleshet in Hebrew or Philistia in Latin, after its 2nd millennium BCE inhabitants, the Philistines, in an effort to separate the Jews, many of whom they exiled from their land. Among the Gentiles, the name Palestine stuck. By the early 19th century, after centuries of Byzantine rule and successive Persian Arab, Crusader Arab, and Ottoman conquest, Palestine was an impoverished backwater, but it had religious cachet for the three monotheist faiths. It was the divinely promised land of the biblical chosen people, the Jews. Jesus was born, preached, and died there, and the Muslim prophet Muhammad, according to an early interpretation of a line in the Quran, had begun his nighttime journey to heaven from Jerusalem, though the land was conquered for Islam only by his mid-17th century successors. Jews and Christians, and later some Muslims, especially those living in Palestine, designated the country the Holy Land. But neither before the 12th century defeat of the Crusaders at the hands of the Muslim general Saladin, nor after it was Palestine administered or recognized as a distant and separate province by any of its Muslim rulers. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled the area from the early 16th century, divided Palestine into 2 or 3 subdistricts, sanjaks, that were ruled from the provincial capital of Damascus. From the 1860s, the southern half of Palestine, from a line just north of Jaffa and Jerusalem southward, was constituted as an independent sanjak or mutasarflik and ruled from Istanbul, while the northern parts of the country, the sanjaks of Nablus and Acre, were ruled from the provincial capitals of Damascus and from the 1800s Beirut. In 1881, Palestine had about 450,000 Arabs, about 90% Muslim, the rest Christian, and 25,000 Jews. Most of the Jews, almost all of whom were ultra-Orthodox, non-nationalist. The poor lived in Jerusalem, the country's main town, population 30,000. About 80% of the Arabs lived in 700 to 800 agricultural villages, the rest in about a dozen small towns, including Gaza, Hebron, Nablus, Tiberias, Jaffa, Haifa, and Acre. Many rural inhabitants, especially in the lowlands, were tenant farmers, their lands owned in a semi-feudal relationship by wealthy urban landowners or effendis. The first wave of Zionist immigrants, the first Aliyah, literally ascent, brought to Palestine's shores between 1882 and 1903 some 30,000 Jewish settlers. Their aim was to establish a gradually expanding core of productive Jewish towns and agricultural settlements that would ultimately result in a Jewish majority and the establishment of an independent sovereign Jewish state in all of Palestine. Defined usually as the 10,000 square mile area lying between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, but occasionally in line with the Bible and subsequent Jewish conquest in the 2nd century BCE, as also encompassing the north-south mountain ridge just east of the river, the biblical lands of Golan, Gilead, Moab, and Edom. The Zionists planned to purchase land either piecemeal, dunam, a fourth of an acre, after dunam, or outright in bulk of the Ottoman Sultan, who was always strapped for cash. But the Sultan, who regarded Palestine, like all his territories, as sacred Islamic soil, and whose vast empire was under increasing nationalist assault in the Balkans and European imperialist threat everywhere, declined to part with the land. So the Zionists generally maintained discretion about their objective. In private correspondence, however, the settlers were often forthcoming. The ultimate goal is in time to take over the land of Israel and to restore to the Jews the political independence they have been deprived of for these 2,000 years. The Jews will yet arise and, arms in hands, if need be, declare that they are the masters of their ancient homeland. The 19th century poet Naphtali Herz Imber, who later penned the lyrics for what was to become Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, the Hope, wrote, "If you long to inherit the land of your birth, buckle on the sword and take up the bow, and go in the footsteps of your fathers with weeping and tearful pleadings. Zion will not be won with sword and bow. Hark ye, Jerusalem will be rebuilt." Of course, the integrity of the Ottoman imperial domain was not the only obstacle to Jewish statehood. There were also the native inhabitants, the Arabs. Often the Zionists depicted Palestine as a land without a people, awaiting the arrival of the people without a land. In the British Philo-Zionist Lord Shaftesbury's phrase from July 1853. But once there, the settlers could not avoid noticing the majority native population. It was from them, as two of the first settlers put it, that we shall take away the country through stratagems, without drawing upon us their hostility, before we become the strong and populous ones. By stratagems, of course, they meant purchase. Buying land occasionally required stratagems, since the Ottoman authorities were generally ill-disposed towards Jewish land acquisition. But the purchase of Palestine proceeded at a snail's pace, and it was not mainly the problem of an effendi reluctance to sell. Most of the world's Jews were non-Zionist, and most simply were poor, especially in the Zionist movement Eastern European heartland. And the rich concentrated in Central and Western Europe, by and large, refused to help. So gathering a rubble here and a rubble there, the initially uncoordinated Zionist associations, Hovevai Zion, or Lovers of Zion, bought the old tract of land for settlement and then set out small groups of individuals or families to fulfill the dream. The bulk of the settlers of both the first and second waves of immigration, the second Aliyah was from 1904 to 1914, planted roots in the lowlands of Palestine, in the coastal plain, the upper Jordan Valley, from the southern end of the Sea of the Galilee to the northern tip of the Galilee Panhandle, and the Jezreel Valley, connecting them. These were the less crowded areas of Palestine, often swamp-infested and vulnerable to Bedouin depredation, and owned largely by effendis. The peasants of the hilly Judean, Samarian, and Galilean heartland tended to own their lands and were rarely willing to sell. But the gradual Jewish population of these lowlands in fact competed with and trumped the natural expansion into them, ongoing since the early 19th century, of spillover Arabs from the relatively thickly inhabited hill country. In hindsight, what was effectively a demographic-geographic contest for the lowlands between 1881 and 1947 was won by the Zionist movement and gave the Zionists the territorial base for statehood. The new settlers, beset by an unwanted and difficult climate, unfamiliar diseases, and brigandage, viewed the native inhabitants as, at best, brigandage, viewed the native inhabitants as, at best, unwanted interlopers from Arabia, and at worst as rivals for mastery of the land and potential enemies. But they had to be appeased at least temporarily, given their numerical superiority and their kinship with the Muslim Ottoman rulers. Like most European colonists in the Third World, the settlers saw the locals as devious and untrustworthy, and at the same time as simple, dirty, and lazy, but did not bother to learn Arabic, and some mistreated their Arab workers, as the famous Russian Jewish essayist Ihad Hayim reported after a visit in February-May 1891. The natives, in turn, regarded the foreign influx as inexplicable, and the settlers as strange, foolish, infidel, and vaguely minority. Initially, the Zionist settlement enterprise was haphazard and disorganized, but in the mid-1890s at last an organizer and prophet arose. He was an unlikely savior. Theodor Herzl was born in Budapest in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1860 to an assimilated German-speaking Jewish family. He was a doctor of law, but quickly changed professions and became a successful journalist, feuilletonist, and playwright. The coffee shops, theaters, and salons of Vienna were his milieu. Herzl knew no Hebrew, Yiddish, Russian, or Polish, and had no contact with the poor masses of Eastern Europe. The pogroms and anti-Semitic discrimination in the Tsar's empire may have niggled at his conscience, But the eruption of the Dreyfus Affair in France in 1894 converted Herzl to Zionism. He was then the Paris correspondent of the New Free Press, a liberal Viennese daily. Alfred Dreyfus was an assimilated Jewish army captain on the French general staff when he was wrongly convicted of spying for Germany and sent to Devil's Island. A number of French intellectuals protested and were shouted down as unpatriotic. Right-wing crowds flooded the streets of Paris shouting, "Down with the Jews!" Herzl was shocked and quickly persuaded that popular anti-Semitism was not restricted to the backward Tsarist Empire, but was the patrimony of the entire Gentile world, including its refined French core, the heartland of liberalism, socialism, and democracy. Herzl reached a dismal conclusion. There was no hope and no future for the Jews in Europe. It could not and would not assimilate them. And in the large, multi-ethnic continental empires, Jews would eventually face the hostility of the various minorities bent on self-determination. Ultimately, the Jews of Europe faced destruction. The solution was a separate independent Jewish state to be established after a mass migration of Jews out of Europe. Herzl dashed off political manifesto, The Jews' State, 1896, and spent his remaining years organizing the Zionist movement. He unsuccessfully canvassed Europe's potentates, including Sultan Abdul Hamid II of Turkey, to grant the Jews a state. But the Sultan, unwilling to relinquish any part of his steady diminishing empire, rebuffed Herzl, a master bluffer who had promised the Ottomans billions, which he did not have and probably could not have raised. And although some of Europe's leaders, notably Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, were interested in getting rid of their Jews, none was enthusiastic enough to challenge Ottoman rule in Palestine or to vouchsafe any of their own imperial domains for a Jewish purpose. Herzl was equally unsuccessful with Europe's Jewish financial barons. The Rothschilds and their ilk were wary of the wild-eyed prophet or of seeing to engage in an activity that smelled of dual loyalty. Herzl died, possibly of syphilis, in 1904, a broken man at the head of a poor, unsuccessful movement. Just a personal note, I imagine religious Jews cringe and start going into convulsions when you use the word prophet to describe Herzl. But I think most people see the meaning of the word as in him having a vision and now the succession and fruition of that dream manifest. Nothing to do with religion, really. Just making that note. And I don't know why, because everyone probably knows that. But Herzl's was a success story. He had generated enough noise to place the Jewish problem and his preferred Zionist solution on the international agenda and to hammer together the rudiments of a world-embracing Zionist organization. In Basel, in 1897, the first Zionist Congress, organized by Herzl, had resolved to establish a publicly and legally secured home, Heimstätte, for the Jewish people in Palestine. The delegates had avoided the words state and sovereignty for fear of alarming or antagonizing Gentiles, including the Sultan or Jewish magnates. But that was what the Zionists intended. However, of course, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, which was hostile to Zionism, both because it was a Jewish enterprise. Islam had little respect for or empathy with the Jews, who were sons of apes and pigs in the Quran, infelicis phrase, unfelicitous phrase, and because it promised to reduce still further the Sultan's domain, and it was inhibited. For most of Palestine's impoverished, illiterate inhabitants at the end of the 19th century, nationalism was an alien, meaningless concept. They identified themselves simultaneously as subjects of the multinational Ottoman Empire and as part of the multinational community of Islam, as Arabs in terms of geography, culture, and language, as inhabitants of this or that region and village of a vaguely defined Palestine, and as members of this or that clan or family. There was no Arab national movement, and not even a hint in 1881 of a separate Palestinian Arab nationalism. But European ideas had begun to penetrate the Levant via commerce, tourists, missionaries, and books and newspapers. Nationalism began to touch the minds of a thin crust of the better educated and rich in Damascus, Beirut, and Baghdad, and Palestine notable families collectively known as the Ayan, from whom sprang the country's doctors and lawyers and municipal and religious leaders, were not completely immune. Perhaps the first expression of their dawning Arab national consciousness are to be found in their at first hesitant, later vociferous appeals to Istanbul from 1891 on to halt the Zionist influx. They warned that Zionist immigration and settlement threatened to undermine the country's Arab character and perhaps ultimately to displace its inhabitants. The Jews are taking all the lands out of the hands of the Muslims, taking all the commerce into the hands and bringing arms into the country, complained a group of Jerusalem notables. They called on the Sultan to halt Jewish immigration and to bar Jewish land purchases. Indeed, by 1899, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Tahir al-Husseini, the father of Muhammad Haj Amin al-Husseini, the future leader of the Palestinian national movement, was proposing that all Jews who had settled in the country after 1891 be harassed into leaving or expelled. These petitioners sensed that the initial trickle of settlers was but a thin edge of the wedge and would be followed by masses of European Jews who, backed by the Jews' reputed legendary wealth, would Judaize the country. They were vaguely aware of the anti-Semitism that was propelling the Jews to Palestine. Indeed, some of them shared the prejudice. But they saw no reason why they should host Europe's expellees or pay any price for the plight of Europe's Jews. And they failed to acknowledge the Jews' historic ties to the land, denying these Russian-speaking, strangely apparelled immigrants any innate rights or just claims. In this sense, Yusuf Daya el-Khalidi, Jerusalem's mayor, was highly unusual. In a letter to Zadok Khan, the chief rabbi of France, he wrote that the Zionist idea was, in theory, natural, fine, and just. Who can challenge the rights of the Jews to Palestine? Good Lord, historically, it is really your country. But in practice, he was as opposed to Zionism as the rest of Palestine notables. The land was already inhabited, and Zionist immigration would spark resistance. Palestine could be reclaimed only by the sword. Better that the Jews reestablish themselves elsewhere. In the name of God, let Palestine be left in peace, he wrote in March 1899. Khan passed on al-Khalidi's letter to Herzl, who replied on the 19th of March. Herzl reassured al-Khalidi that the Zionists, with their vast wealth, expertise, and initiative, would bring benefit to all of Palestine's inhabitants, Arab and Jew. The Jews, he averred, were not warlike, and there was no reason to fear their influx. But al-Khalidi and his fellow notables were not persuaded. Indeed, in 1905, an exile named Semitic an exile anti-Semitic Lebanese Arab nationalist, Naguib Azori, voiced what was probably on the minds of Palestine's politically conscious notables when he wrote that the Jews were bent on reconstituting their ancient state in the whole territory stretching from Mount Hermon to the Arabian Desert in the south and the Suez Canal in the west. The Jews, he added, were destined to clash in a fight to the finish with the emergent Arab national movement. However, Istanbul, while periodically ensuing restrictive orders, never effectively clamped down on Jewish immigration, land purchases, and settlement. The Turks, no doubt, were misled by the apparent negligibility of the ongoing enterprise. But there was, too, Ottoman inefficiency and venality. Almost everyone in the administration had a price. Bribes were routinely paid for entry permits and their extension, land deals, building rights. Slowly, the Zionists planted roots. Although the overwhelming majority of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe made tracks for North America and the British dominions, well over 2 million of them by 1914, a hard, resolute cadre reached Palestine, bought land, and settled. By 1914, there were some 4 dozen settlements, including the bare beginnings of Tel Aviv, in the wind-swept dunes north of Jaffa, and the first kibbutz, Degania, in the marshes just south of the Sea of Galilee, both founded in 1909, and 60,000 to 85,000 Jews, about 2/3 of them vigorous, idealistic Zionists in Palestine. The Zionists encountered little Arab violence in the first 2.5 decades of settlement. The Arabs lacked political nationalist awareness and were thoroughly disorganized. The Turks ruled the land, and though generally sympathetic towards their co-religionists, often backed the streets in disputes over land or settlement. Intercession by local Western and Russian consuls with Ottoman administrators and by ambassadors in Istanbul also benefited the settlers. But there were occasional acts of violence. Until 1908-1909, they were mostly of a criminal nature or appeared to be routine feuds between neighbors. An Arab with a knife bent on robbery would waylay a settler on an isolated footpath, as happened to David Ben-Gurion in August 1909 near Sajira in the Lower Galilee. Ben-Gurion emerged with a wound in the arm and a deep-seated suspicion of the Arabs, or a group of Arabs would harass a Jewish couple strolling along the beachfront, as happened in Jaffa in March 1908. The attack triggered wider Jewish-Arab melee in the town center, or settlers and their Arab neighbors would quarrel over farming rights and land usage in newly acquired tracts, as happened in Petah Tikva, Melabes in 1886, in Rehovot in 1892 and 1893, and in Gadara, Quatra in 1887-1888. Despite an acknowledgement of Arab resentment or antagonism, the settlers and Zionist spokesmen were wont to dismiss such brawls as common among Arabs, between one tribe and another, or one village and another. But in 1909-1914, the violence increased and took on a clearer nationalist flavor. During those 6 years, Arabs killed 12 Jewish settlement guards, the preeminent symbols of the Zionist endeavor, and Jewish officials increasingly spoke of Arab nationalist ferment and opposition. Already in 1907, Yitzhak Epstein, a Zionist educator, had published an article, The Hidden Question, in which he acknowledged the emergence of a national conflict between Zionism and the Arabs. We have forgotten one small matter. He berated the Zionist leadership. There is, in our beloved land, an entire nation which has occupied it for hundreds of years and has never thought to leave it. We are making a great psychological error with regard to a great, assertive, and jealous people. We forgot that the nation that lives in Palestine today has a sensitive heart and a loving soul. The Arab, like every man, is tied to his native land with strong bonds. Zionism, he warned, would have to face and solve the Arab question. And he urged the settlers to know the Arabs, their culture, and their language to facilitate dialogue. In 1910 to 1911, Arabs in the north tried to resist the Zionist purchase of and settlement in a large tract of land in the Jezreel Valley. Ironically, the opposition focused on the tenant farmer village of Fula, built on and around the ruins of Lefev, a Crusader fortress Saladin had conquered in 1187. Henceforward, Arab spokesmen were regularly to identify the Zionists as the new Crusaders. Arab notables sent off a stream of appeals to Istanbul. Shots were traded, and an Arab and a settlement guard were killed. But nothing availed. The authorities upheld the purchase. Fula was evacuated, and within months a Jewish settlement, Merhavia, took root on the site. Arab anti-Zionist rhetoric flourished. The Zionists were now regularly charged with aiming to kill, pillage, and violate Muslim women and girls. All in quotes. Explicitly anti-Semitic images were mobilized. The blind Muslim cleric and politician Sheikh Suleiman al-Taji al-Faruqi in November 1913 published a poem in the recently founded Arabic newspaper, Palestine, declaring, "Jews, sons of clinking gold, stop your deceit. We shall not be cheated into bartering away our country. The Jews, the weakest of all peoples, and the least of them, are haggling with us for our land. How can we slumber on?" The outbreak of World War I, pitting Britain and its allies, chiefly France, Russia, and later the United States, against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, temporarily halted Arab Zionist violence. But the war was to refashion the Middle East and significantly advance both the Zionist cause and Arab nationalist aspirations. From the first, Palestine was on the front line. It served as the Ottoman army's base for two unsuccessful cross-Sinai offenses against British-ruled Egypt in 1915 and 1916, and was in turn invaded by a British army from Egypt. Throughout, under Ottoman martial law, both Arab and Jewish inhabitants had been subjected to systematic confiscations, principally of agricultural produce and farm animals, and repression by the Turkish soldiery. Let's read that again. Throughout, under Ottoman martial law, both Arab and Jewish inhabitants had been subjected to systematic confiscations, principally of agricultural produce and farm animals, and repression by the Turkish soldiery. Worried by possible pro-Allied nationalist subversion behind the lines. In October-December 1917, the invading British Army under General Edmund Allenby conquered the southern half of the country, including Jerusalem. The following September, after smashing the Turkish lines north of Jaffa, the British took Samaria and Galilee, and then pushed on to Damascus and Aleppo, forcing the Turkish surrender and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. The British had been assisted from summer 1916 in a minor way by a remunerated revolt of Arab tribes in Hijaz, led by the Hashemite family. Their camel-borne army drove northward through Transjordan in parallel with Allenby's northward advance through Palestine. Britain had promised the Hashemites sovereignty over the Arab-populated areas of the expiring Ottoman Empire. But Palestine was ambiguously omitted from the future Arab domain in the letter of 24th of October 1915 from Henry McMahon, Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt, to the Hashemite Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali. Instead, it was alternatively vouchsafed for future Anglo-French condominium in the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 3rd of January 1916, and more vaguely, as a Jewish national home in the Balfour Declaration of November 1917. That one-sentence declaration by the British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights of the political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country, was to be seen by the Zionist movement, which had vigorously lobbied for it, as a historic breakthrough and a basis for its future sovereignty over Palestine. And indeed, the British, including Balfour, and despite the avoidance of the word state, regarded the embodied promise as necessarily leading to self-determination. My personal hope is that the Jews will make good in Palestine and eventually found a Jewish state. It is up to them now. We have given them their opportunity. Balfour was to say 3 months later. The Arabs, who greeted the declaration with bewilderment and dismay, came to regard it as a negative milestone, an act of betrayal. Thereafter, no matter what the British did to the contrary, the Arab world was to regard London as the protector and facilitator of Zionism. The British had been driven by Zionist lobbying, spearheaded by the able, charming Chaim Weizmann, a Russian Jewish chemist who had made Britain his home. But Weizmann had been preaching to the converted to the extent that many in the imperial cabinet, including Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Balfour himself, had long been philo-Zionist for Protestant, religious, and humanitarian reasons. To be sure, there had also been imperial concerns. A British-created Jewish state might help guard the eastern approaches to that vital waterway, the Suez Canal, only recently imperiled by the Turks, and empowering the Jews in Palestine might reap rewards among the Jews of the United States and Russia, whose goodwill the British wanted against the backdrop of World War I, either to acquire or sustain. Without doubt, the British had ignored the will of Palestine's Arab inhabitants. Both imperial powers at the time generally took no note of the wishes of third world peoples, and there were specific, extenuating circumstances. The Arabs of Palestine, like the majority of those outside Palestine, had supported and were still supporting the Muslim Ottoman Empire in its war against the Christian Allied powers, and there was at the time no Palestinian Arab national movement nor any separate Palestinian Arab national consciousness. Indeed, Arab national awareness with concomitant political aspirations was barely in its infancy among the elites in the neighboring Arab centers of Beirut, Damascus, and Baghdad. Moreover, the primary agents of Arab independence during the war, the Hashemite leaders of the Desert Revolt, appeared not to be averse to Jewish rule over Palestine. When Weizmann met Faisal, Hussein ibn Ali's son and the commander of the Hashemite army in a wadi in southern Transjordan in June 1918, the two men got on famously, and Faisal, interested in Zionist support for Hashemite ambitions, endorsed Zionist colonization of Palestine. When the dust had settled, Faisal was installed by the British as ruler in Syria, while his brother Abdullah was given a separate emirate in Transjordan. In March 1920, Faisal declared himself king of Syria and Palestine, but in July 1920, partly in response, the French, already masters of Beirut, invaded Syria and conquered Damascus, ejecting Faisal. The British then reinstalled Faisal as king of Iraq, which he and his offspring were to rule for almost 40 years. France emerged from the World War with League of Nations mandates over Lebanon and Syria, while the British held sway directly over mandated Palestine and Iraq, and indirectly over Egypt and Transjordan. The grand Hashemite vision of one giant, powerful Arab state had dissipated into a handful of smaller, separate, semi-independent or mandated Arab territories, at least temporarily under Western imperial boots. But the imperial powers were only partly to blame for this fracturing of the Arab world. So too were the Hashemite princelings and the separate local Arab nationalist groupings in Damascus, Baghdad, Beirut, and Cairo. Each sought power and independence in his own turf. None wished to be ruled from the remote medieval village of Mecca by the would-be unifying tribal chieftain, Hussein ibn Ali. The imperial carve-up left British-ruled Palestine cut off from its former provincial capitals, Damascus and Beirut, now under French control. And the Palestinian elite quickly understood that their future would be separate from that of Syria and Lebanon. Thus, 1920 was to prove crucial in the emergence of a separate Palestinian Arab national movement and a decisive movement in the evolving Zionist-Arab conflict. The events in Damascus had released Arab nationalist passions and were indirectly and directly to lead to the first major Arab-Jewish clashes in Palestine. These broke out in March, April that year in the Galilee Panhandle, a grey no-man's land between the French and British areas of control, a band of Arab marauders, driven by either anti-French or anti-Zionist sentiments, in the first week of March assaulted the Jewish settlement of Tel Hai. The assault led to the Zionist evacuation of the area, to which the settlers returned only in October after Britain and France had agreed that the Panhandle would be part of the Palestine Mandate. But this was a sideshow. More ominous was the outbreak on the 4th of April in the midst of the Muslim Nabi Musa, the prophet Moses, festivities of pogrom-like Arab rioting in Jerusalem's Old City. A Muslim religious procession, the marchers wielding knives and clubs, erupted in anti-Jewish violence, shouts of Idba el-Yahud, slaughter the Jews, and Muhammad's faith was born with the sword, filled the air. At the end of 3 days, 6 Jews lay dead, with about 200 injured and a handful raped. The British authorities had reacted lackadaisically. Are you serious? Lackadaisically and ineptly, drawing from the Jews the accusation that they had behaved like Russian policemen during pogroms. No, my outrage wasn't for the attacks, although I am outraged by that, of course. No, my outrage was for the word lackadaisically. What the hell is that? The Zionist-led leadership, prodded by veterans of Hashomer and Zionist Self-Defense Guards Association, founded a dozen years before, and the Jewish battalions that had fought with the British Army in World War I, reacted by establishing an underground national, or ethnic militia. The Haganah organization, Irgun Haganah, Hebrew for defense organization, known simply as the Haganah. The 1920 outbreak was only the first in a series of bouts of violence, 1921, 1929, 1936 to 1939, that grew progressively more lethal and more extensive. The spread of national consciousness during the 1920s and 1930s clearly paralleled and probably drew sustenance from the dramatic increase in literacy among Palestine's Arabs, one of the fruits of the enlightened British Mandate administration. Increased prosperity, triggering hopes of further betterment, relative political freedom, and the gradual emergence of an urban middle class also tended to radicalize the population. This burgeoning national consciousness periodically expressed itself in anti-Zionist violence. But violence did not emerge only from modern nationalist passions. It also drew on powerful religious wellsprings. Nothing, it seemed, could mobilize the Palestinian Arab masses for action more readily than Muslim religious rhetoric and symbols. It was no coincidence that the April 1920 outbreak was triggered by religious festivities, or that the far larger outbreak of 1929, in which about 130 Jews were murdered, including 66 ultra-Orthodox non-Zionist yeshiva students massacred by their neighbors in Hebron, was prompted by accusations that the Jews intended to take over the Haram al-Sharif, the notable sanctuary, the Temple Mount, destroy its two sacred mosques, and rebuild the Solomonic temple at the site. And it was indicative that the emerging leader of the Palestinian Arab national movement, Mohammed Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was to dominate Palestinian politics until mid-1948, was a Muslim cleric, an unusual phenomenon in Third World nationalist movements. Al-Husseini and others consciously deployed religious rhetoric and symbols to mobilize the masses for the anti-Zionist and later anti-British violence. But of course, the chief recruiting agent for Palestinian Arab nationalism was Zionism itself. Above all, the fear of an antagonism toward the Zionist enterprise fueled national awareness and passions in the salons, coffee shops, and streets of Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa. Yet Palestinian Arab society was acutely fragmented, and British mandatory rule aggravated this divisiveness. Palestine's Arabs exhibited little national solidarity, neither in 1920 nor in 1947. In the years between, few Palestinians proved eager or even willing to sacrifice life or purse for the national cause. A major fault line ran between the Muslim majority and the generally more prosperous, better educated Christians who were concentrated in the large towns. The British authorities favored the Christians with contracts, permits, and jobs, further alienating the majority. Through the Mandate, especially in such crisis periods as the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 and 1947 to 1948, Muslims suspected Christians of collaborating with the enemy and secretly hoping for continued Christian British rule or even Zionist victory. These suspicions were expressed in slogans popular during the revolt, such as "After Saturday, Sunday." That is, that the Muslims would take care of the Christians after they had sorted out the Jews. This probably further alienated the Christians from Muslim political aspirations, though many, to be sure, kept up nationalist appearances. The Christians of Jaffa had participated in the 1936-37 disturbances under duress and out of fear of the Muslims. The Christians' hearts, now and generally, are not with the rioting, reported the Haganah Intelligence Service, HIS. A Haganah list from the mid-1940s of Arabs with a, quote, tendency to, cooperation with the Jews, end quote, included, quote, many Christians, end quote, but few Muslims. Loyalties in Palestinian society continued down in 1948 to run principally along family, clan, and regional lines. Envy and antagonism often divided families and clans within villages, and even more often, village from neighboring village. Frequently, there were age-old blood feuds and land disputes, and the inhabitants of one town often cared little for those of other towns. Commercial rivalry habitually underpinned such hostility. Another major fault line divided the sedentary rural population from neighboring Bedouin tribes, the Bedouins of whom there were almost 100,000 in the late 1940s, were traditionally seen as a threat to village crops and herds. Vaguer but still real fissures also separated townspeople from villagers, who tended to be less educated and less politically conscious, and within towns between notable families and the mass of commoners. Through the Mandate years, the Ayin themselves were badly split. The leading Jerusalem notable families, the Khatibs, the Khalidis, the Hosseinis, Nashashibis, Nusaybis, and Buderis, had been vying for positions of leadership with their attendant prestige, economic benefit, and social political power through the Ottoman centuries. In the 1920s, these rivalries were reinforced by nationalist political considerations connecting to the relations with the new Mandate authority and the challenge of Zionism. At the start of the Mandate, the Husseinis emerged as the country's most powerful Urbine clan. Musa Kazim al-Husseini, the mayor of Jerusalem, served as chairman of the Palestine Arab Executive, the national movement's leadership body, until 1934, and Hajj Amin al-Husseini was appointed by the British as Jerusalem's Grand Mufti, 1921, and head of the country's Supreme Muslim Council, 1922. Subsequently emerging as the head of the Arab Higher Committee, AHC, and the leader of the Palestinian Arab National Movement. An opposition, Mu'ardiun, emerged, rallying around another of the notable Jerusalem families, the Nashashibis. Through the 1920s and 1930s, and more subtly during the 1940s, the opposition struggled against Husseini's dominance, occasionally backing this or that British measure or proposal and assisting the Mandate government, covertly or overtly, and even occasionally receiving material support from the Jewish Agency for Palestine, the emerging government of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine. Each clan was supported by other notable clans and elements of the rural and urban masses, often a function of each clan's economic interest and holdings. For form's sake, the vying coalitions of clans set up political parties, but in reality, what characterized Arab Palestine during the Mandate was a feudal two-party system with the Husseinis pitted against the opposition. It was a struggle for power and its benefits, not an ideological clash, though the Husseinis almost from the start painted their opponents as collaborators with Jewish rule and soft on Zionism. The Nashashibis, though also ultimately desirous of political independence for Palestine under Arab rule, appeared to be more moderate than the Husseinis, whom the British and Zionists branded as extremists. Throughout the Mandate, the leading Arab families, including Husseinis and opposition figures, sold land to the Zionists despite their nationalist professions. Jewish landholding increased between 1920 and 1947 from about 456,000 dunams to about 1.4 million dunams. The main brake on Jewish land purchases, at least during the 1920s and 1930s, was lack of funds, not any Arab indisposition to sell. Moreover, hundreds of Arabs collaborated with the Zionist intelligence agencies. The bouts of violence of 1920, 1921, and 1929 were a prelude to the far wider, protracted eruption of 1936 to 1939, the Palestine Arab Revolt. Again, Zionist immigration and settlement, and the prospect of the Judaization of the country, and possibly genuine fears of ultimate displacement, underlay the outbreak. But this time the threat was palpable. The resurgence of anti-Semitism in Central and Eastern Europe had washed up on Palestine's shores, an unprecedented wave of Jewish immigration. The country's Jewish population more than doubled in less than a decade, rising from 175,000 in 1931 to 460,000 in 1939. 1935 alone had seen the arrival of 62,000 legal immigrants. A far smaller number of illegals also trickled each year into the country. In less than a decade, the Arab proportion of the population had declined from 82% to under 70%. What Arab cannot do his math and understand that immigration at the rate of 60,000 a year means a Jewish state in all of Palestine? Ben-Gurion, chairman of the Jewish Agency Executive, JAE, wrote to Moshe Sheret, in brackets, director of the agency's political department in 1937. Throughout the mandate period, there was also limited legal Arab immigration to Palestine from neighboring countries, prompted by the mandate's relative prosperity, as well as an indeterminate amount of illegal immigration, often seasonal, linked to this or that harvest. For example, according to HIS, 525 Arabs arrived legally from neighboring countries in 1944, 829 in 1945, and almost 3,000 in 1946. Most of the latter Christian Arabs recruited to serve in the Palestine police. The Zionist leaders intermittently attempted to reach a compromise with the Arabs, but none proved possible. The Palestinian Arabs consistently sought to halt Zionist immigration and demanded all of Palestine. The Zionists as consistently insisted on continued immigration and Jewish statehood. Ben-Gurion argued that the Jewish influx would better the condition of the Arabs as well as the Jews. Musa al-Alami, a leading Palestinian moderate and assistant mandate attorney general, countered, "I would prefer that the country remain impoverished and barren for another 100 years until we ourselves are able to develop it on our own." You see? And Arab nationalists outside Palestine were no more amenable to an accommodation. At a meeting in 1936 between JA representatives, Eliyahu Elath, Dov Haas, David HaKohen, and Joseph Ne'mani, the leaders of the Syrian National Bloc, Shukri al-Qawathli, Faiz Bey al-Khoury, and Lufti Bey al-Hafar. Al-Quwatli countered, "What is the use of economic well-being if we are not masters in our own home?" after Hawes made the conventional arguments. But you didn't make your own home. You simply were there. You made no attempt at national... Whatever. You don't understand. Both communities increased in power and size during the beneficent years of the Mandate, but the Jews fared far better than the Arabs. They received enormous contributions and investments from Western Jewry and large British government loans. The Arabs benefited from little foreign investment or loans. Jewish numbers had grown under the Ottomans from some 25,000 to 85,000 between 1881 and 1914. By the end of 1947, they had reached 630,000. The Arab increase had been less dramatic, from 450,000 in 1881 to 650,000 in 1918 to 1.3 million in 1948. Economically, Palestinian Arab fortunes had steadily improved, but the Jews had soared. The net domestic product of the Palestine Arab community in 1922 had been £6.6 million. In 1947, it was £32.3 million. During the same period, the yeshuvs had rocketed from £1.7 million to £38.5 million. The net product of the Jewish community in the manufacturing sector had jumped from £491,000 in 1922 to £31 million in 1947. The Palestinian Arab equivalent was £539,000 to £6.7 million in 1945. I mean, what's wrong with... In most other fields, the Yishuv had also advanced by leaps and bounds. Perhaps most significantly, the Jewish managed to forge internal, democratic, governing institutions, excuse me, which in 1947-1948 converted more or less smoothly into the agencies of the new State of Israel. The Jewish Agency for Palestine served as the Yeshuv's government, its executive. The GAE, from 1929 until 1948, functioning as a cabinet. A number of bodies, such as the Jewish National Fund, the Histadrut Agricultural Center, and the agency's settlement department, promoted land reclamation and settlement activity. The Yishuv established a national healthcare system, the Histadrut's sick fund, and educational systems catering to its constituent communities, secular, socialist, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. In 1925, with a population of about 150,000, the Jews established their first university, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. By comparison, Palestine's Arabs established universities in the West Bank and Gaza Strip only in the 1970s, ironically while under Israeli military occupation. From 1920, the Yishuv had a national militia, the Haganah, which in mid-1948 became the army of the new state, the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, to run its institutions. The Yeshuv efficiently taxed itself. By contrast, the Arabs relied for their institutions, such as the Supreme Muslim Council, and their services on British government funding. Starting in April 1936, armed Arab bands based in the villages and urban Kashbas began to attack Jewish traffic and passerby. At the same time, the Palestinians reorganized politically, setting up national committees, NCs, in each town and the Arab Higher Committee to oversee their struggle nationally. Both the AHC and the NCs initially represented the various political factions. The AHC declared an open-ended general strike and demanded British withdrawal and Palestinian independence under Arab rule. At the least, the rebels hoped to bludgeon the British into curbing the growth of Zionist enterprise and Jewish immigration. The revolt enjoyed popular support throughout the Arab Middle East. Even before its outbreak, the Arab world had been smoldering with the idea of jihad, holy war, against the Yishuv. The Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament, Saeed al-Hajj Thabit, on the visit to Palestine in March 1936, repeatedly called for such a jihad.